question is, this House to now adjourn. George Galloway.
Speaker, I'm relieved up to a point that I don't have to come here this evening and savage as an enemy of the people the Minister opposite, to denounce him as a Philistine and a cultural vandal. I'm relieved both because I have always myself considered him rather an adornment to the government of brutes in which he sits, a civilized man, a kind of lipstick on the pig. But the second reason that I'm relieved is because in a meeting that he graciously gave my colleagues and I just a day or two ago, up to a point, he rather shot my fox, because there I was with my parliamentary colleagues. There are 4 parties represented in Parliament from Bradford district, and we were absolutely united and leading what looked like it could become a mass campaign of the entire city and district against a proposed act of cultural vandalism, which the Minister disarmed in the first line of the meeting by telling us that the Bradford National Media Museum would not close. And we're grateful to him for that, though he'll forgive us if we want to look the gift horse a little closer in the mouth, because there are more ways, of course, of closing somewhere than simply locking its doors. But we're grateful that the Minister had the sense to listen to the public, led by the 4 parliamentarians, or the parliamentarians from the 4 parties, 5 of us in total, and the City Council, and the local newspaper, the Telegraph and Argus. There was, as I say, a crescendo of opposition to this proposed closure. And it's only right to commend a minister that listens. And I hope I don't spoil his chances in the forthcoming reshuffle, but I wish him well, and I'm grateful to him up to the point that I must now part company from him. The National Media Museum is a fundamental to Bradford. It's a national treasure, but it's absolutely fundamental to Bradford, a city with a sea of troubles, with mass unemployment, mass poverty, mass child poverty, record infant mortality rates, record deaths in hospitals, and so on. It is a place with so many problems that it could not afford another. If this closure, as leaked, and I'll come to that point in a minute, had gone ahead, it could have been a death blow to a great city, which in 1903 was the richest city per capita in England, but which now in 2013 doesn't have its troubles to seek, particularly in the city centre, where we have a hole in the ground where Westfield was supposed to be, where when I arrived there at least 15 months ago, the Odeon building, iconic, was crumbling and shrink-wrapped and looking like it was going to fall down. And if the National Media Museum had closed on the back of this desertification of the city centre, it could have been a death blow. So I'm grateful that the government have announced that it's not going to close. And that, in part, is because the public expenditure cuts in this age of austerity which the government are imposing on the country have turned out, in the case of this department at least, not to be as severe as planned. 10%, we're told in authoritative media briefings, has been reduced to 5%. But as the late and lamented trade union leader Alan Fisher once said, 5% of bugger all is bugger all. And 5% of a very shrunken budget is going to be a serious blow nonetheless. And so my first question to the Minister, which I hope he will address, is this. The museum's not going to close, wonderful. But what's going to happen to the capital programme? What's going to happen to the capital expenditure on the building? Is the building to be not closed but allowed to crumble? Are the vitally needed changes that are physically needed in the building not going to be possible because, as my colleagues and I will advance, and did in our meeting with the Minister, there are many things that need to change about the National Media Museum. So that's the first question. The second question I want to ask the Minister is this, that I have real doubts as to whether this National Media Museum belongs in the science group of museums at all. After all, media to me is an art rather than a science. Of course, the science of how film, radio, television gets into your living room or your cinema is interesting, but it's not as interesting as the content of the film, radio and television. The National Media Museum in Bradford is the repository of the National BBC Archive. But who knows about it? Who can access it? Who can see it? I believe that the whole question of this National Science Museums Group should be brought into question by this debate. Of course, honourable friend.
I'm delighted and I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, but on the point of the BBC, the Minister will know that there was a radio station within the National Museum that was hosted by the BBC. That left at March of this year without any fight from the Media Museum about it going. And that's why we all smelt a rat, if you like, and my honourable friend might want to comment on that, that they allowed people like the BBC to leave without a fight, and that surely had an impact on the visitor numbers to the museum.
Undoubtedly, it was one of the most popular attractions, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Interactive, people getting behind a desk, make-believe interviews and so on. Future politicians were being groomed in Bradford in that studio. Now gone, and no fight put up for it. Indeed, skipping ahead a moment to what I was going to say, I belong to that school of socialists that belong to the Deng Xiaoping school. I don't care whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. So I want to, in the few minutes I have, advance this point. Of course, the state must be a major stakeholder in museums, and things like free admission must at all costs be defended, because we have 500,000 visitors to the museum. It's down from 1 million, it's true, but it's not nothing. And of that 500,000, most of them, the overwhelming majority of them, are from Yorkshire and Humberside. And most of them, very unusually for a museum, are from lower socio-economic groups. Charging would be a death knell for us. And the state must be there to guarantee that that does not happen. But the BBC is a national institution, deeply in need of a new lick of paint to renovate its tattered public reputation. Why doesn't the BBC help to pay for the National Media Museum? Why can't the BBC logo that used to be at White City be up on that building? Their archive is there, the public pays for the BBC, and heaven knows any money they spend on the National Media Museum might save us from some hours of tripe which is included in their output, I'm sorry to say. The BBC or other media outlets. I'm not arguing for the rehabilitation of Mr. Rupert Murdoch here, though I did write to His Highness Prince Walid bin Talal with his great media interests and ask him to sponsor the museum. That's how desperate I was, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Perhaps, I'm glad to say, he didn't reply. Yes.
Well, can I first of all commend the honourable gentleman, my parliamentary neighbour, for not only securing this debate but for the way he has worked with all the other Bradford MPs in order to secure the future of the museum, and I pay fulsome tribute to him for doing that. Would he agree with me that it goes to show that although we may disagree wildly on lots of issues, that we do all have the best interests of the Bradford district at heart, and that it shows that when we do work together what we can achieve? And would he join with me in saying to the Minister and the Science Group of Museum that we will continue to work as Bradford MPs on a united front, not just to secure the short-term future of the museum, but also to make sure it has a long-term viable future as well?
I'm grateful for that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it's absolutely true, and it's quite a rare species, a Northern Tory MP, and our district has 2 of them, and they turned out both to be able and dedicated parliamentarians, and they were ready without qualification to throw themselves into a more obvious popular front led by my friend from Bradford South and I, and the Liberal Democrats too, in the case of the member for Bradford East. We all came together as one hand and I think we moved mountains. And at least this leak of a closure gave us the opportunity to show what politics can do, what public opinion can do, how governments can be influenced and made to listen. Thinking along the lines I was just earlier describing, if the media should be paying something towards the National Media Museum, the country gives a fortune to the train operators, the privatised train operators. Why can't we force them to help my other honourable friend from York to make sure that the future of the National Railway Museum in York is secured? Not just kept open. This is a point we're all keen to make. Keeping something open and letting it crumble and die is no use. These are national treasures. If our country can strut around the world at the G8, the G20, when we're not bugging people, telling them how, I'm sorry, there's a D notice on that, telling them how important a country we are, then we can certainly pay for the upkeep of these national treasures. Equally, the Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester, which I visited a week or so ago, is another national treasure. Imagine the idea of Manchester, the workshop of the world, having its Museum of Industry closed. But why isn't industry helping to pay for that museum? After all, it's a showcase of British industry. Indeed, why is it in the Minister's Department at all? The museum in Manchester could more, I think, satisfactorily fit into the Department of Business, or what used to be Trade and Industry, thus relieving the pressure on the department in making the investment that's necessary in our museum. I believe, some may say, what's in a name? But why is our museum called the National Media Museum? Indeed, in the age of Leveson, the word media doesn't have immediately attractive connotations. Why shouldn't we call it the National Museum of Film, Radio and Television? Then it would do what it says on the tin. And everybody loves film, radio and television. And moreover, with the archive there, there's no reason why we couldn't fill that museum every afternoon, showing some of the jewels in the crown of the BBC National Archive. I'm glad to.
May I also express my gratitude to the honourable member from Bradford West for initiating this debate. A little earlier, you referred to the leaking of the state of the group as a whole, but the Media Museum in particular, and I'm particularly annoyed about that, being in that we should have to rely on a leak rather than a more mature approach, which would have been to have involved at a much earlier stage the MPs. A number of suggestions have already been put forward tonight by the honourable member from Bradford West, but I believe collectively we could have worked much harder, much sooner, and all the hysteria and indeed the huge anxiety which was created across the Bradford district could possibly have been avoided.
Indeed so, and the honourable member was right to be cross about that in the meeting that we had. Although, being a glass half full man, I saw it as having given us an opportunity to shine. But the honourable member is absolutely right. And this brings me to perhaps the only discordant note I intend to make. The Minister must listen to this, please. The performance of the leadership of the Science Museums group has been sadly lacking in this affair. Indeed, we had the spectacle of the leadership of the group rubbishing the performance of museums under their own purview, apparently oblivious to the obvious fact that if these museums were underperforming, they themselves were being paid rather a lot of public money to preside over their underperformance. And I must say to the Minister,